Thank you so much for joining us today. I am very happy to welcome all of you, our special speakers, guest speakers, participants to this webinar. This webinar is organized by the Earth Charter International and Education Center on Education for Sustainability that is located here at the University for Peace in Costa Rica. So I want to send you warm greetings. And we are organizing this in collaboration with our partners from China, the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation. We are very grateful with the partnership with you and Pace Institute also from China. And we are organizing this webinar as part of our UNESCO chair on education for sustainable development that basically focuses on that intersection between what is sustainability, what are the values and principles that could guide us towards sustainability, and how can we transform education in such a way that our education experiences and processes could be more transformative in order to reorient our learning and our societies towards a more sustainable way. So a question that we keep asking ourselves here for the past 20 years, which is part of the work that we do with the Earth Charter, has to do with what are the values and ethics that could guide humanity towards a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. And that question is part of our research projects, and it's also part of our courses and education programs that we run here from Costa Rica under the framework of our UNESCO chair. And the worldview that is articulated in the Earth Charter invites us to think about the way in which we are relating to one another, the way in which we are relating to ourselves and other human beings, but also the community of life. So it's a whole invitation for us to think about how we ought to relate if we are to exercise and embrace our ethical responsibility with the well-being of the planet, with the well-being of people, and the well-being of the large community of life. So we are very glad that we have Jeremy Lent here joining us today. Jeremy Lent is the author of this wonderful new book that's called The Web of Meaning, and which we are going to learn more today. But he's a very well-known author who has been writing, even before this book, about ecological civilization. And I think that's one of the reasons why it brings us together, because we have a very close and shared interest on this common themes, including ecological civilization and worldviews. So I would like to also express my gratitude to Linda Wong, who is here with us today as a commentator. She is the Deputy Secretary General of our partner in China, the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation. And we also have the pleasure of having Fridtjof Capra as our very special guest speaker with us today. So thank you so much. Jeremy, thank you for joining us today. I think you need to unmute yourself.
There we go. I'm unmuted now. I just wanted to say thank you, Mirian. I'm really delighted to be sharing this conversation with you. And I have such tremendous respect for the Earth Charter, which I mentioned a number of times in the book, The Web of Meaning. So it's a very special experience for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Jeremy, I think everybody who came to this webinar today is very curious to hear from you on your book. So could you share with us what are the 3 most important ideas that we can find in your book? If you can extract just some key insights that we could find there.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I guess really the first idea really that comes out in the book is that the way in which we make sense of the world today and the dominant worldview, that dominant worldview is not just dangerous and driving us to destruction, but it's plain wrong. It's based on facts that are no longer facts, that were determined by a 17th century scientist in Europe hundreds of years ago, and have been shown by modern science to be wrong. So that's probably the first primary message. And along with that comes, equally important, is this realization that there is another worldview available to us. It's a worldview that indigenous traditions around the world have been talking about for millennia, that other traditions, East Asian traditions like Buddhism and Taoism and Neo-Confucianism have offered. And this is what's key. It's a worldview that modern systems and other science disciplines have been pointing to too. It's a worldview ultimately of our deep interconnectedness. And that's what it really it's explored in the book. And really, I guess the third final point that I hope comes out of the book by the end is that once we realize the validity of this worldview and our own deep interconnectedness with everything else around us, with all of society around us and all of life, we realize that each of us is deeply embedded in this web of meaning, and that each of us has a part to play in actually feeling the pain of life on Earth right now as it's under attack from our civilization, and being engaged in making a difference towards re-energizing life on this planet.
So it seems that you have explored a lot in your book and also in your previous writings, the role of worldviews in what we are doing, and also in terms of the problem of the predominant worldview. Could you share with us a little bit more about what's the problem with the predominant worldview and how can we change that?
Yes, well, sure. And maybe just to say a sentence or two about worldviews in general, because they're not something that we generally think about too much. But a worldview is incredibly important. It's like the lens with which we see reality. And most people don't even realize they have a worldview. They go, well, this is the way it is. This is reality. But that's the thing about a lens. Just like we don't realize we have a lens in our eye that actually takes in information and processes it. So once we become aware that actually what we think is reality is actually just reality seen according to a certain way of thinking, that frees us up to actually recognize that and look at other ways of making sense of things. So this current worldview that people just take for granted, that really began mostly in the 17th century Europe, is a worldview of separation. Fundamentally, it says that humans actually, even within a human, that we're split, we're separate between our mind and our body, and that humans are essentially separate from the rest of nature, from the rest of the living earth. In fact, that nature itself is like a machine. And in fact, even our bodies are sort of machines that our sort of essence exists in. And as a result of that, if we think of nature as a machine, then it's absolutely fine to exploit it as much as possible, to just view it as a resource to optimize for our human needs, whatever they might be. Those are the key elements of this worldview, along with the sense of individuality, the sense that each of us exists as separate individuals, separate from the rest of society, and of course, separate from the rest of the living earth.
So what could be the relationship, if you could articulate the relationship between worldviews, values, and our actions? Do you talk about that in your book?
Yeah, a lot actually, because really, and the book looks a lot at values themselves. And in fact, values come out of the worldview we have. So in our modern worldview, if we see each other as individuals, and even nature itself is seen as a set of essentially living organisms driven by selfish genes, in the words of Richard Dawkins, who has been instrumental in getting this worldview to be widely accepted and thought of as being very scientific. So if you think of all of life as being driven by selfish genes, and then we're told that humans, by acting as selfishly as possible, it's actually really good because that's how capitalism works. And that it ends up being for the best benefit of everybody because that makes for a more efficient society. Then that leads towards values based on individual libertarianism, selfishness, and greed, basically. And we're told that's okay. So when we shift our recognition of how we are in the world as being one of interconnectedness, it begins to change our identity itself. because what arises actually, and I explore this in the book, our values themselves come from our identity. If I see myself as an individual, my values will be based on individual freedom. If I see myself as, if my identity is part of my nation, my values might be based on nationalism. If my identity is with all of humanity, then I'll have values to really want to shift society towards the well-being of humanity. And if my identity expands to include all of life, then I will want to make sure that what I'm engaged in my life moves society towards not destroying the rest of life on Earth, but actually helping to regenerate it. And so that's where the worldview shifts our identity, and our identity naturally leads to the values that we live our lives according to.
So, but it seems that not everybody around the world they're interested to talk about values, because values for many people seem something abstract or something that belongs to the world of philosophers, right, and not to something that is practical. How could you respond to that, and also on the need to cultivate the right and appropriate integrated values that the world currently needs? How can this take place?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Well, you know, values themselves are a little bit like worldviews, are something that people don't necessarily think about a lot, but actually they live according to those values, whether they are considering it or not. So the things that people hold sacred within their society, whatever it might be, and in many parts of the world, patriarchy has a lot to play in that. And people, you know, men view that women should be kept in ways that are less empowered than they are. Or then people feel that private property is something that's absolutely sacrosanct. Well, there are things that people just take for granted. Those come from underlying values that people don't necessarily even think about because they're so used to everybody else sharing them, which leads to that other question you asked. If this is the case, then it seems like we have a really huge job on our hands to try to transform these values that we feel are more life affirming. And we don't have very much time to do that. We're all aware of the climate emergency we're looking at and the ecological breakdown, and that we're rapidly moving fast in the wrong direction. So this is a huge issue. And, you know, of course, I don't set myself up as having all the answers to that. But one thing I will say is that the values that I'm talking about are actually values that every one of us as human beings actually does share, in the sense that they're core human values. They're values that we as humans evolved, and they're values that really differentiate us from other primates, values of things like group identity. We have, as humans, moral emotions. And it's not true that we have to overcome some sort of selfish nature that we have. Actually, we humans evolved to have a strong feeling of things like compassion and fairness and altruism and respect, generosity, and all the values that actually could lead to a positive transformation of our civilization. So even that while our world seems to be careening in the wrong direction, what is so powerful about this message of deep interconnectedness is that really at a deep level, every human being feels that is actually true, even if they've been conditioned as they've been growing up to ignore that, to reject that, and to essentially become numb to those things. But every human being that's born into this world starts off with this intrinsic tendency towards that sense of deep connectivity. That's what we need to do really, is open people up to kind of reject some of their conditioning and reconnect with what is there inside each of them.
Very nice. So I was very happy to see in your book that you refer to the Earth Charter. I would like you to talk a little bit about that in this connection with the ecological civilization, but mostly also with this need on cultivating integrated value for our current times and challenges. What do you think is the role of the Earth Charter in all of this?
Yes, yeah. I think it plays a hugely valuable role. And in fact, I would love to see the Earth Charter becoming way more central in mainstream thinking and just be getting to be understood as the sort of place you look for the foundation of not just building values that are actually life affirming, but really how we actually reconstruct our society in ways that are life affirming. You know, just like currently in law, people go back to this English document, the Magna Carta, from something like the 12th century or whenever it was, and it's viewed as the sort of foundational document that led to the ways of thinking that are now understood as sacrosanct ideas under law. What I would love to see is really the Earth Charter over time becoming recognized as really like the Magna Carta, the foundational document that so many wise people together spent years working together to collaborate on, to create, that can be used as a real solid foundation for building the different kind of civilization that we need.
Mm, thank you. Yeah, in order for that to take place, a lot of awareness raising, education processes at all levels and contexts is needed. Because precisely one of our education center purposes has to do with the importance to expand and deepen our consciousness with regards to our worldviews and what would be the kind of worldviews and values that could guide us to this different direction in terms of the history of human civilization. And we see the Earth Charter as a framework or as an ethical reference in this challenge.
Right.
You also write and talk about rewriting the operating system.
Yes.
Can you share with us what does that mean and how can that take place?
Yes, absolutely. You know, and what this has to do with is a lot of the time when I talk about this need for these deep shifts in our worldview, people can respond quite appropriately by saying, we don't have time for all this. You know, we've got to fix the stuff right now, like tomorrow. We need to invest in renewables. We need to, you know, tax these big transnational corporations. And there's things we have to do right away. And we just don't have time to deal with anything else. But I like to give this analogy of, if you imagine like a very complex software system that basically had bad sort of operating system to begin with, but then people keep having to fix all these bugs that arise. And as you fix the bug, you basically create even more bugs. And so then you have, so you imagine like tons and tons of people scurrying around, trying to fix bugs. And then somebody comes along and says, wait a minute, what we need to do is change the operating system itself. And then everyone says, we don't have time to do that. We have to fix these bugs. But oftentimes what you can do is work on shifting the operating system, even while people are fixing the bugs in the short term. So then it's ready to basically replace from within. And similarly, absolutely, we need to invest in renewables. All these things that millions of people are working on around the world, I support and I encourage, and I want to see that invested in more. At the same time, that's not enough. As long as we have this operating system that of our civilization is basically wealth affirming, that's based on the accumulation of wealth above all else, that actually leads to this global growth-based capitalism with these transnational corporations that are just established to be for profit alone, to maximize shareholder profits and grow profits as fast as possible and treat the world as a resource for exploitation. As long as that system is in place, all the best things we try to do to make it a little bit better are not going to turn our civilization around. That's what I mean by changing the operating system. We basically need to look again and say, what could a civilization look like if actually we started off from principles of life affirming, and actually looking at the principles that have caused ecosystems to be healthy for millions of years, in spite of all different things that might happen climate-wise or any other exogenous variables, but they maintain their health. What can we learn from those principles of life applied to our civilization? And how would that look if we actually rebuilt it from the ground up on life-affirming principles?
Let's talk about ecological civilization. What is that in your view? And how can that take place? How can that happen? I mean, it seems to be quite a challenge, considering that our predominant worldview in the mainstream civilization now is not really living that, and we are very happy that the Chinese government really took a stand and aspires to work towards an ecological civilization. But for you, Jeremy, what does that mean, and how can that emerge?
Yes, well, when I look at that vision of an ecological civilization, it essentially is the words that I see most appropriate for what I was just describing, for this construction in our ideas and in our actions and our activities as communities of a civilization that is based on the foundation of life-affirming principles. And when we actually look at ecosystems and find out what are some of those life-affirming principles, well, one of the first things we see, for example, is that what life evolved over billions of years on Earth was different species discovering that by actually working together in mutually beneficial symbiosis, they were able to actually find sustainable ways to enrich themselves, to work for their own benefits with the other benefits, and actually leading to a richness and diversity of ecosystems that we enjoy today. So the first way to think about it is, if we were trying to actually establish a society where the goal, rather than wealth accumulation, was the true sustainable well-being of all people within that society on a living earth that was truly healthy. And the first thing we'd look at is that notion of symbiosis, asking ourselves, what can we do as human beings, not to exploit nature, but actually to act in a way that's for our benefit as well as for the benefit of nature. In human relations, rather than companies looking at how can we get workers at the cheapest way possible, how can we manipulate consumers' minds to buy our product as fast as possible, to look at things from a very different perspective and say, how can the different elements of human society, whether it's companies or communities, or even people working in the commons, work together for mutual benefits?
Thank you. You know, ecological civilization is something that I think should attract us all in trying to figure out how to make that happen from our different positions and work we do, and the ways in which we could collaborate. Because the fact is, I think we ought to be asking ourselves our shared common view with regards to what does that mean, and how to contribute. I think once we walk towards that path, we can be contributing to making this planet certainly more balanced and sustainable and flourishing. I think we do have an ethical, moral responsibility to be committed to make that happen, and look at the importance to contribute to planetary well-being through those lenses. Now, if there is an organization in China that has been seriously working on that, is our friend here, the CBC GDF from China. And I'm very happy that Linda Wong, who is the Deputy Secretary General of our partner organization in China, is joining us today. Linda, I would like to invite you to come to the floor to share your thoughts on ecological civilization, and also what you have heard from Jeremy Lent in his new book.
Thank you so much for this opportunity for me to learn and to share. Actually, I was quite surprised when I see the Jeremy's new book talking about the term ecological civilization. Why? Because it was also based on my own experiences 2 years ago. In 2019, you know, we are a member of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is IUCN, and it will host is the next World Conservation Congress, or WCC. So we, as a member, we submitted a motion proposal. It's called Adapting Traditional Medicine to Fulfill the Vision of Ecological Civilization to IUCN WCC, hoping that traditional medicine in the world can be more sustainable. Unexpectedly, it has become the most controversial motion in the whole Congress. Why? Western countries believe that ecological civilization is a unique term only to China and cannot be written into the text of IUCN, WCC. So in the debate, replied that the concept is not unique to China, and it is recognized by the United Nations. And you know, even the next Biodiversity Conference of the United Nations will be themed on ecological civilization. And the difficulty was not only from foreign government representatives, but also from our own country. On the other side, the industry in our own country also objected to that proposal. We were asked to withdraw this motion. After 10 rounds of discussion on the online consultation, this motion was finally revised into a different name. It's now called Adapting Traditional Medicine to Achieve Social and Environmental Sustainability. You know, the term ecological civilization has been cancelled, replaced. Okay, so that's why I thought maybe many Western people think about that term as a unique Chinese term also, although we found that very surprising. And now I'm very, very happy to see this book, and I'm very happy to see Jeremy, your book, you talked a lot about the traditional wisdom and traditional civilization, and we need to learn, and we need to reflect on our current way of life and to find the solutions resort to the traditional wisdoms. And I also found it is actually very amazing. You use the term Li, Neo-Confucianism, Li. That's really, really very good. And actually, today I'm so excited to join this dialogue to learn. Actually, I'm learning from you. I was a philosophy major, and I was majored in ethics, moral philosophy, when I was in Peking University. And Mr. Du Weimin, he was one of the guest professor at our university. So I know he's also a very featured person today in the world of study of Neo-Confucianism. So to see this new book, The Web of Meaning, I have a lot of I have a lot to share. I also made a PPT, but I will do that later. I guess the term what impressed me mostly is the you said interconnectedness, the connectivity. Okay. Because my organization, the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation, it is an environmental NGO, and it is dedicated to biodiversity for more than 3 decades. So connectivity is a commonly used term in biodiversity conservation. When we talk about the ecosystem, we talk about the connectivity a lot. For example, today, many people feel that the Yangtze River, right? China's longest river. It was once the most biodiverse water ecosystem, but today it was announced as no fish, no fish in Yangtze River. Why? Let's reflect on the way over the past decades. The connectivity on the Yangtze River and is the whole basin interrupted by many constructions like hydropower stations, larger or small, a lot actually, and the fish cannot migrate, cannot go back to their breeding sites or so. But previously, biodiversity don't speak. Okay, they can't speak. So people took it for granted to build such mega projects without any consideration about biodiversity. And today we suffer from the consequence. So,
exactly. Yeah.
so today, but very fortunately, today China is calling for the ecological civilization now become mainstream in China, and the country has enforced a policy. I forgot from which year, maybe last year, to total ban fishing, commercial fishing in Yangtze River to restore the biodiversity. So this is a good signal. Also, another word I heard a lot from your book is about nature. We need to follow the nature. We need today the lifestyles we take for granted today actually not good. We get used to the say one-time use water bottles, right? Bottled waters and utensils or so. And when we suffer from the consequence of climate crisis and biodiversity loss and the plastic waste or so, what can we do? We can only change from ourselves. We need to make the change, and we are urging the bottom-up way of changes in at least in China. Given the opportunity, I would like to share more. So now I will give the floor to Mirian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. We are giving you the option to share screen shortly. So Jeremy, in your book, at the beginning of your book, you talk a lot about relationships, the importance of relationships, but you also describe quite a lot on the Chinese traditional values, which was actually something that was also quite discussed when the Earth Charter was being drafted. To Wei Min gave a very significant contribution also with regards to the self and our relationship with the various levels of communities that we belong to. So Jeremy, would you share a little bit more on the research you did in which you shared at the beginning of your book?
Yes, sure, absolutely. Because one of the sort of overall meta messages, if you will, that is coming out of my book is that we as a human civilization right now, we need to get the best wisdom from all different cultures. We don't need to be caught up in that kind of conversation that Linda was just talking about at the IUCN, saying, oh, we don't like that idea because that comes from this country, and we don't want it to be associated with this kind of thing. Like, we're in a place now, right now, where as a species, as a global civilization, we are under massive threat through our own activities, through things that we have done wrong that we need to do right. At this point in humanity's story, we need to jettison these ideas of which culture gets primacy here or there, or is it science, or is it spiritual traditions, or whatever. And we need to look at an integrated way of moving forward that takes the best of all around us, that takes the best of indigenous wisdom, that has been there, people on the earth, connected with the earth for thousands of years, have a lot of wisdom that has not been destroyed, where they're maintaining a deep understanding that we all can learn from. China has great traditions, both in the Buddhist tradition that is obviously way beyond China too, but which China incorporated a lot, and the Neo-Confucian and Taoist traditions. And of course, there's great scientific understandings now. We can integrate those. And that's one of the biggest messages of this book, is that we don't need to get sort of parochially narrow in terms of how we move forward. And looking at, for example, indigenous traditions, or how we lived as human beings for 95% of our human species in nomadic hunter-gatherer bands, that doesn't mean we need to sort of go backwards. It doesn't mean we should have these ideas there was some golden age that we should get to. It means that there are great insights, deep pieces of wisdom that if we integrate them well, we can actually develop a worldview to move forward that can be for everyone's benefit and the benefit of life too. So that's a big message that comes, really, I'm trying to put out in the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think our current civilization needs to move beyond our national national borders and
Right.
be at ease with our local identity, or cultural identity or national identity, but also our planetary identity, and see ourselves at the same time citizens of our local community, our countries, and also global citizens. And therefore that requires certainly different lenses and different levels of our sense of responsibility with the common good. It's time to
That
move
is
on that direction.
Yeah, absolutely true, Mirian. And if I could say something about that, really there's this key theme that also runs through the book, which is, again, what we learned from nature, which is this theme of integration. And we can think of integration as basically being this recognition of unity with differentiation. So when we're talking about, say, a global worldview or our global shared humanity, that doesn't mean that we have to give up pride in our own ethnic self-determination. Doesn't mean we have to give up our own sense of individuality or things that are very specific to our area, our region, or our nation. It means that we can celebrate those and let those flourish as long as they are recognized that they are actually done so as part of the flourishing of the whole total ecosystem of life on Earth. And once we look at that, we develop what I call a concept of fractal flourishing. You know, we know that fractals basically patterns that repeat themselves at different scales throughout all of nature, basically. The idea of fractal flourishing is that the flourishing of each individual actually can only arise out of the flourishing of all the different layers with which that individual is embedded, from cells in our bodies to organisms to ecosystems. I think that's a key concept.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Linda, would you like to make a comment now, or can we move on to Fridtjof? Maybe let me invite Fridtjof Capra. Would you like to open your mic? And thank you so much for joining us today, Fridtjof.
Pleasure. Hello, everybody. I would like to comment further on Linda's example, and let me say it's a pleasure to meet you on the little screen. I'm very happy to meet you. This tragic example of the Yangtze River is really a powerful illustration of what Jeremy said before, that a worldview shapes our actions, even if we don't acknowledge the worldview. Because when you think of it, as you explained, the development of hydropower stations destroyed the ecosystem. Hydropower stations were developed by people who thought a river is flowing water under the influence of gravity. And that's it. That's all a river is. And we can exploit the gravity in the flowing water, and we can harness power and electricity from it. But a river is much more than just flowing water under the influence of gravity. A river is a whole ecosystem. And this is what they didn't realize. And it's interesting that in another part of the world, there is also a huge power station where people did realize that. And that's in Brazil. One of the biggest rivers is called Iguaçu, and the company that has the power station is called Itaipu. And about 20 years ago, they developed a concept of good water. I think, Miriam, that's the translation. It's agua boa.
Cultivando, yeah, cultivating good water.
Good water, yeah. So cultivating good water. And what they did was they not only cleaned up the basin of the power station, but they also protected the ecosystems. They supported local communities, local markets, local schools, and it went on and on and on for decades, and all centered on the idea of good water, meaning that water is, a whole ecosystem.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. Every time I'm having a trouble explaining system thinking and explaining on the importance of having a company that is really committed to these things. I use Itaipu as a good example of a project that is really looking at the importance of water as their main resource, but also in engaging the different actors and in the importance of reforestation of the river bank.
I also want to ask Jeremy a question, if I may, if you don't mind. I want to address a really urgent problem that we have today, and that is that in the midst of the climate crisis, where we are surrounded by firestorms, by heat waves that we have never seen before, by floods and inundations, buildings collapsing like the one in Florida because the limestone underneath is softened by the rising sea levels, all these catastrophic effects of climate change. And yet so many of our corporate and political leaders deny that either completely, or if they sort of grudgingly admit it, they don't take the urgent action that is needed. And it seems that advancing cogent arguments to change people's minds is not enough, because somehow, you know, their denial is rooted in certain values. And it seems to me, Jeremy, that you provide a very original analysis of that. You don't mention what I just talked about, but your analysis of two kinds of intelligences, the conceptual intelligence and the animate intelligence. And if you could talk about this a little bit, and then, you know, maybe say something about how you think this could be applied to, you know, convincing our political and corporate leaders about the urgency of the climate crisis.
Yes, I hear you, Fritjof, and every one of us who is aware of what's going on with not just climate breakdown, but ecological breakdown, obviously are feeling this sense of outrage and frustration when we see it virtually ignored in the mainstream media and mainstream politics. And I think that there's a couple of key things here. I think the most important thing, to get to your question, is that, as you say, people don't get persuaded by rational arguments. And there have been all kinds of social psychology studies that show that actually even well-educated, college-educated people, if they have an ideology, the more you argue what we think of as just factual to get them to change their mind, the more they will double down. Actually, sometimes even more than people who aren't as well-educated, because we use our left hemisphere, that rational way of thinking, is actually recognized in cognitive science to be like this interpreter. It'll do anything, sort of like our own lawyer in our brain, do anything to make an argument to support what our organism wants to support, which means that what we really need to do is connect with people at the level of heart, much more than connecting at their level of head. And that actually does lead to a transformation in how we relate to things. I mean, I'm sure virtually all of us have just within our own families, people who just sort of will double down on these views that we find so frustrating, and how do we deal with this? And I think that in all these cases, what we really need to do is reach out and find our shared humanity. As I was talking before, the values that we're talking about here, these values of deep interconnection, are actually values shared by every human being. Even those people that we see as those leading our society to destruction right now, they don't want to feel they're bad people. They don't go around saying, I'm a really bad person and I'm working to destroy the earth. They actually justify what they're doing, feeling, they want to feel good about themselves. And when we can get them to be caring more and more about their own grandchildren and about like future generations, and actually caring about something in their life that connects them with the living earth, that's the kind of way in which we can get people to shift their values. But at the same time, I feel that we have to recognize that we're not going to make these transformations happen by, step by step, trying to get these millions and millions of people who are close to these ideas to open up to them. I think what we need to do is realize that there are actually untold, probably hundreds of millions of people who right now are sharing this deep sense of outrage at what's going on, this sense of wanting to fight for life, to struggle for life. And what we need to do is connect up with those people. Organizations like Extinction Rebellion that actually just got people to get on the streets and say, we're not going to accept this anymore. Those are the kinds of organizations in incipient forms that are going to be needed to transform where we're going. If we rely on big government and we rely on sort of so-called green corporations to make the changes for us, it's simply not going to happen. I think that that's where we need to look. We need to support people like Greta Thunberg, new generations who are growing up into this world, recognizing that they're growing into a world that is going to be a disaster for them. And we need to empower them and help them to connect up. And most importantly, for those of us who are somewhat in the older generations, is to use anything we have to give them solid, coherent platforms so they can believe in something different than what their parents' generation is telling them.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's very good. Can I go back to Linda Wong, who wanted to share some more with us? Linda, very briefly.
Yes,
we're
here.
looking forward to hear.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity and to share my thoughts about the web of meaning. I'm inspired and I would like to share some of my ideas. The first one is understanding interconnectedness helps us to achieve the SDGs in a holistic approach, because we have 17 such goals and we cannot sacrifice one goal to achieve another. In reality, through my work over the past years, I found it's a kind of a problem when it comes to biodiversity conservation. For example, actually, biodiversity is closely related to our the whole world and our future generations, but we cannot understand it. People will also usually I often questioned, why should I care about biodiversity when I'm the dominant #1 species? I sometimes tell them that to enjoy a nice cup of coffee, the coffee is sustained by at least 20 species. And today, the rapid loss of biodiversity means tomorrow that our food insecurity. So I will give you the example, and it's also maybe added evidence to details to the as you see the left picture. This is in Yunnan province, a water conservancy project. The bottom of those rivers.
Oh, your voice. Something happened with your microphone.
Okay, is this better now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good. So the biodiversity is sacrificed for the sake of climate action. So we need to consider all of our activities in a holistic way without sacrifice one to achieve another. Yunnan is the most biodiverse region over the whole world. It has many native species of indigenous fishes, like the right one shows, and projects like this is not good. The next, so we strongly objected to this project, and gladly they have heard about our voice and stopped some of the project. And the next, let me. Okay, this one is a good story actually. The construction of a river project. This was in Hebei province. It was destroying the breeding sites of migratory sand martins. As you can see in the left picture, they have sand dunes. It looks useless, but the seemingly useless sand dunes are breeding sites for migratory sand martins. As you can see in the right picture, those birds, tens of thousands of those birds come to this area in every April or May and for breeding, and after that they live in summer. So these seemingly useless places actually are critical for the species, and the sand martins, those birds also played a very, very important role in local ecosystem. They eat pests and they bring ecological value to local, but even though people may not realize that. So we when we receive our reports from our volunteers in the local, and we went to the site, we asked them to stop, and we wrote official letters to the provincial government, and they intervened, and after rounds of dialogues, finally they, as you can see in the center picture, they agreed to leave it untouched, and they also put some Chinese characters. It's called Island of Sand Martins to
we are having a problem again with your microphone sound, Linda. I would recommend, if you would like, I think we need to move on, and maybe you can stop sharing the screen to see if it increases your volume or sound.
Stop my sharing my screen. How about now? Does it better?
Yes. Now we
okay. We also we need to reflect on the feeling of beauty. Although actually I have some very beautiful pictures. Example is that today we get used to the very cleanly mowed grasslands in cities, but why not let wild grass grow? We are calling for rewild our cities. Take Beijing for example. Beijing is a city that a serious shortage of water resources, and but a lot of water is used in maintaining the grass as the city beauty. So not only water, but also the excessive use of chemicals and pesticides cause a lot of pollution and problem. So, well, we talked to the forestry department of city planning, and we also talked to the universities to have some pilot projects to rewild the campus, rewild the city. And the Peking University has become the first wilderness in school campus area in China. It became, although the space is kind of small, but the school protected area is meaningful, and it teaches, it helps us to rethinking about our current way of life. So, okay, I will talk by now. Mirian, thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Linda. It's good to hear from you. It's always good to hear some concrete examples of how this can be done, or how to make things better. Sometimes I think it's also an issue of being conscious, or of lack of consciousness sometimes also that's precluding us to move ahead on this. May I invite, we also have Professor Anupam Saraf, who is here with us. May I invite you to come to the floor to make a comment specifically to Jeremy Lent or ask a question. Professor Saraf is an expert in systems thinking and dynamics.
Thank you, Mirian. And brilliant to hear you, Jeremy. Very inspiring and very thought-provoking. So thank you very much for all that you shared with us today. I want to really ask you questions relating to two themes. So the first one is really coming from a systems perspective, where as a systems practitioner for over 30 years, I tend to see the world as made up of wholes. And these wholes are individuals who come together, or parts of a system which come together to form a whole. So from that context, if one were to try and interpret how values are formed, would you like to place some comment about whether these values emerge from the individuals or from the wholes, from the interactions? And also, what do these values have to do with the purposes for which the wholes come to be?
Right.
And then from that perspective, what is the importance of systems literacy in terms of spreading values and understanding of values and worldviews for the larger community of people across the world? So that's my first theme.
Yeah.
And the second theme is essentially, if one were to look at the whole of the planet, and when we talk about the Earth Charter, we are really looking at the planetary well-being. So I would like you to comment on how can we use the lens of the Earth Charter, particularly the 4 pillars of the Earth Charter, the idea of respect and care for the community of life, ecological integrity, social and economic justice, and democracy, nonviolence, and peace, in order to look at planetary well-being. And what would be the importance of that?
Wow. Well, thank you for these amazingly deep and thoughtful questions. Just those themes alone are enough to spend maybe another hour discussing. So I'll try to keep my responses fairly brief to them. And well, let me just start off with what you were saying about wholes and parts in relation to values. And well, some of the things that I spoke about just a little bit earlier is this kind of recognition that really arises from my book, that actually our identity is the source of our values. And when we think about our identity, when we begin to really learn what that actually means in this kind of integrated web, what we begin to see is that identity doesn't have to be fixed in any one layer. So I can feel like I have identity as an individual. I'm not giving up my individuality by identifying with all of life or anything like that. And it's fine for me to identify with my family, with my community, with my nation, with all of humanity, and then with all of life. And one of the things that I think we can develop in what I call an integrative consciousness, a consciousness that actually integrates all these different layers, is this holding, rather than an either or a black and white, holding a multi-layered sense of our identity and recognizing this notion of what is sometimes referred to as a holarchy, a term that Arthur Koestler first termed, which is this recognition that each entity actually exists within larger entities, which then exist within larger entities. And the total holarchy we can think of as the Tao or the Earth system, depending on whether we want to approach it scientifically or spiritually. But when we look at it like that, then we can recognize that we don't have to we don't have to get stuck on one way of saying, well, actually our values come from me as an individual and then flow out, or the values begin with the whole. But the values begin with this kind of recognition of what I was referring to before as fractal flourishing, that once we see ourselves as part of a holarchy, we want all the different parts to be flourishing. And that means that we start to see things not in terms of zero-sum gains, like my benefit is at the expense of somebody else's, but looking to that mutually beneficial symbiosis at all layers of scale. And that's what we need to like shift our ways of organizing society, developing technologies, et cetera, to do. And as something that kind of comes from that to your second thing you talked about in terms of purpose, like where does purpose come from? And actually one of the chapters of my book is actually entitled The Deep Purpose of Life. Because when we look from almost like a physics perspective at the whole universe of flowing towards entropy, what we get to understand life as being is essentially a rebellion against entropy. It's like this way of self-organizing all energy matter of the universe in ways that are meaningful. And life itself has this purpose of maintaining its own health and reproducing its health and finding the most efficient ways to do that. And it's been billions of years doing that. And we can see ourselves, each of us as human beings, not just that we are alive or that we're part of life, but we are life. We are one manifestation of this unfolding over billions of years of life's rebellion, essentially, against entropy. And once we realize that, it gives us a sense of purpose. We actually can have, in the words of what Albert Schweitzer, the great 20th century humanitarian, says, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And as a result, I cannot but have reverence for all life. So I feel that that is where our connection with life itself leads fundamentally to a sense of values coming not from what we think we should do, but what we actually want, recognition of who we are. And what I would like to suggest when you were asking about the development of systems thinking, the importance of that on what we need to do to transform society, if I could actually defer to Fractal Capra, who I see as one of the great leaders in the world today on exactly this issue. And perhaps, Fractal, if you'd like to talk more about, so much of what you spend your life doing, actually working to develop this greater systems understanding.
And maybe also on the importance of systems literacy,
Yes,
or systems understanding at various levels.
Exactly.
And why is that important? Fridtjof?
Well, I think, thank you. I think systems thinking is so important today because our world is so interconnected globally. I grew up in Austria, and when I went to high school as a teenager, you could not make a phone call to the United States. Or if you did, it was very complicated. You had to go through several operators. And traveling to the United States was also very complicated. Today, we are all on the internet and we communicate with one another as we do right now on various platforms. We can also watch sports events. Like this morning, I watched the Tour de France in the Pyrenees in southern France. I saw these beautiful mountains. As a matter of course, I just switched on the television and there it was. So we are totally interconnected. And this interconnectedness has many consequences. One of them is that whatever we do will travel very fast around the world through all these connections. And therefore, there are no isolated problems or no isolated phenomena. The major problems of our time are all interconnected and interdependent, whether we talk about energy or climate change or social justice or, health issues, economic issues, the pandemic, of course, now. All these issues, all these problems are fundamentally interconnected. They are systemic problems because this is what systemic thinking means. Thinking in terms of interconnectedness, in terms of relationships, in terms of context, in terms of patterns. And that is not only intellectually fascinating, like Anupam, I've spent several decades studying and practicing systemic thinking. it's intellectually fascinating, and it is also literally necessary for the survival of human civilization today.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and if I could just add an element to what you said, Fritjof, really relating to your other question about how we do relate to the head versus the heart. For many people around the world, if the actual sort of cognitive approach to systems thinking seems to be too complex, and they might switch off around that, I think what's so important is to let people feel that interconnectedness, and let people feel that when they just walk in nature, or when they look at somebody else in the eyes, somebody who maybe is even a stranger, but actually looking at that connectedness at the micro levels, at the major levels, those are the things that actually, because to your point, Fritjof, our major problems are all interconnected. Our major solutions are also going to be based on that interconnection. So,
when I grew up in Austria, coming back to that, and when I go to Austria, there are these beautiful nature walks in the mountains, and when you hike in the mountains and you meet other hikers, you greet them as a matter of course. In the cities, we don't do that. But in nature, you greet other people, and that's acknowledging what you just said, fellow human beings, relatives. And then, of course, we have indigenous traditions who extend that to all living beings and say, all living beings are my relatives. And so when I'm hugging a tree, I'm hugging a relative, which is completely natural to many people.
Exactly. And so those are the ways in which we can really turn around our way of thinking. And the actual trend.
Okay, so we are experiencing some problems with the sound from Jeremy. And
Whoa,
he comes back. Okay, so Jeremy, let me bring some of the voices from the floor. As you know, this session is being live streamed China through Baidu, and also through the Earth Charter International YouTube channel, and through Jeremy Lent's Facebook page.
So I just want to say, we saw that the sound problem is not a Chinese problem. It also is a problem in Berkeley.
Thank you. That's good. It may happen. So let me bring first a question from YouTube. In the comment in question is, people believe that our cities, wealth, and current culture keep our moral bodies and those of loved ones safe from nature. How can we shift this sensibility when existential fear is driving this? This is a question from YouTube.
Yeah, this is a great point, and really we can go all the way back to the beginning of agriculture, more than 10,000 years ago, for this separation that humans developed and this fear, basically, of what was not cultivated. And that was the very basis of agriculture, was the separation of what you created and what you cultivated versus wild nature out there. So that fear has like deep underpinnings in cultures around the world. And I think we have to recognize also that the future of humanity is going to be very much in cities. That when we're talking about ecological civilization, when we're talking about the needs to transform our society, we're not talking about all of us leaving the cities and all sort of going back to nature. There's way too many humans to relate to nature in that way. But I believe that right now we've turned a point where more than half of the human population is actually in cities. And by the middle of this century, I think it's going to be like something like 70%. And that is actually, ironically, paradoxically, maybe even a positive for the human relationship with the rest of the living earth. That actually, it turns out that cities, just as organisms, there's something called Clibber's law, which looks at how organisms that get larger in size are more efficient thermodynamically in transforming energy into metabolizing. The same is true of cities, and actually larger cities are far more efficient metabolically. And when people are clustered together, they tend to have less environmental impact than when they're more spread out, like in the United States with these big suburbs. So rather than view this kind of urbanization as something negative that we need to move away from, there's this concept that E.O. Wilson has been really getting behind, this notion of half Earth, where what we can do is say, let's actually assign half of all the living Earth to what is non-human. Let's like develop more than corridors, but full ecosystems where those wild ecosystems can actually relate to each other, so they're unbroken by human habitats. And let's, us as humans, enjoy each other's company in cities. And of course, by doing that, we have the benefit of actually having this incredible beauty in a rewilded living Earth to actually relate to in ways that we'd have to be careful not to then destroy through, forming too many sort of tourist type approaches that would then invade that. But I think this is part of the vision of what's possible, is actually realizing that nature needs to be left alone, to rewild. We as humans actually like being together. And there's a valid way for us to live in cities for the bulk of humanity into the future, but also connect with nature in ways that we can treasure it more than try to exploit it the way we have been doing up until now.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And thank you for all the participants who are joining us either through YouTube, Facebook, or the Baidu platform. I have two more questions, if I may. Klaus Bosselman, professor who was joining us from Auckland University in New Zealand, and who is an expert in environmental law. He said, how could we implement ecological thinking or ecological civilization into policy and law? And he wanted to send special greetings to you, Jeremy, and Fritjof Capra. And Klaus Bosselman has also written quite a lot on ecological civilization. Jeremy, how about bringing it to policy and law?
I feel that really I'd like to defer that again to Fritjof, who's actually co-written a book on exactly this question, which has inspired many young lawyers that I've seen wanting to do exactly that. So perhaps Fritjof, do you want to speak about what you have, what you've created in that book?
Well, I feel a little awkward speaking about this because Klaus himself, and hello, we haven't seen each other in a very, very long time, but he has written very brilliantly about this subject himself. But basically, what I have observed together with a colleague of mine, Ugo Mattei, who is a legal scholar, is that in all this literature about worldviews, about change of paradigms, about systems thinking, and all these books. I mean, Jeremy and I are not the only ones writing about this. There are many, many people writing about this, but hardly anybody ever mentions the law. And in fact, the legal profession in some countries like the United States is not recognized very much as an intellectual discipline. When people think of lawyers, they think of court cases, of suing one another about various things. They don't think about scholars who develop a worldview. But there are many jurists who are scholars developing a worldview and who are pointing out that there is a legal dimension to all these problems, because the legal framework is often used to empower nations, to empower the state, or to empower corporations by creating this legal framework which is imposed on people. So as there is a revolution now in the shift of paradigms from mechanistic to systemic thinking, there's also a revolution in the thinking about law from a fixed framework based on, property rights and enforcement by the states to law which is actually lived and is created while we live. So this is a huge subject that needs to be addressed.
And if I can just actually give a shout out about a great young global organization called the Future Law Institute. I put their website in the chat, futurelaw.io, where the actual founders of this were inspired by your work, Fritjof, among others. And they are working globally, similarly to this kind of network, to get people to talk about the way actually applying this deep systems understanding to law. And they actually have a webinar on July 31st, actually on an introduction to interconnected law, which is actually hosted by somebody called Alex May, a UK lawyer who wrote a great piece on interconnected law and open democracy a few months ago that I was very impressed by. So just wanted to give that shout out there.
Okay, I would like to bring maybe two more questions, and we actually run out of time, but I think let's try this and fast. So there is a question that is coming to us from one participant through the Baidu platform in China. And there is a comment and the question is, when I was a child, my parents often told me that human nature is intrinsic good. What education needs to do is to guide our inner goodness. Do you think, and the question is to Jeremy, do you think human nature is good or evil? What role can education, so the role of education, what's that role that education can play today to weaving the web of meaning?
Yes,
especially
absolutely.
For children that are living in cities.
Well, thank you for that question. Actually, that's something I explore in some detail in the book. And I look a lot to Mencius, as to use the English word for his name. And forgive me if I don't say it right, like Mengzhe, perhaps in Chinese, but he was this great Chinese philosopher who fundamentally looked at the notion that humans are intrinsically good. And what we need to do is shed our conditioning to get back to that goodness. And in the West, of course, this modern worldview has said the exact opposite, that actually humans are intrinsically bad and greedy. And the whole sort of Christian tradition has said that we have to sort of overcome our sinning capabilities to get to heaven or to be good. But what cognitive scientists now show, and what evolutionary biologists show, is that Mencius was right all along, that humans evolved to actually have these moral emotions. And all we really need to do is to be raised in ways that actually nurture what is natural for us. There's this great social psychologist in the East Coast of the United States. Her name is Dasha Narvaez, who researches this quite deeply. And she talks about the evolved nest and this recognition that the way our modern, or basically patriarchal society trains children to behave is absolutely against their evolved nature. And what we need to do is reorganize the way that we relate to, from infancy all the way up, to more of a partnership way of relating to people, to our infants and our children, that actually leads to greater well-being, because it's more in line with how they actually are as human beings.
Thank you, Jeremy. One more question from Facebook, and that's the Facebook of Jeremy Lent. And it's a question from Canada, Diana, who is sending a message from traditional cynic territory. And she says, right now, so many of us are feeling desperate and paralyzed in the face of climate change. Do you have any advice about next steps and the steps that we haven't maybe yet taken? How many letters, lifestyle changes, and demonstration will it take Is there something different that we could do?
Yes, yeah, I hear you. Yeah, and I guess the way I would relate to that is one from a more emotional, spiritual place, and one for a more political, engaged place. And from that emotional, spiritual place, I share that, and I'm sure most of the people on this conversation all around the world are sharing it. We are devastated by what's going on. We see the destruction, and it is absolutely, it's more than any of us as human beings can actually hold. It's like, it's almost a greater terror, a greater devastation than life has seen in millions and millions of years. And here we are, a generation that's actually facing it. We need to recognize that, and we need to turn to others around us and share our grief with them, not avoid that grief, but share it. And it's through the sharing and moving from that sharing of grief to engagement that we can actually hold it, and we can actually move into engaging with what we need to do. And I think ultimately, we can look at how badly things seem to be going in so many ways, and ultimately just kind of really kind of not to sort of go beyond that sense of, can we afford to hope, or should we despair, but actually kind of live into this recognition that us doing what we're doing is what life wants us to do, to actually put our lives into actually struggling for life. And ultimately, I do believe that the most effective way we can do that is by connecting with other grassroots organizations around the world. We need to do that work at the sort of party political level and at the sort of state level, all those kind of things. But these people are corrupted by the system right now. They're not going to make the changes we need. And to use the words, Greta Thunberg just wrote this great article the other day saying, all you guys in positions of power and leadership, you've heard us and you've just decided the time is to act. Is not actually making a difference. It's acting as in a show. You're saying all these things, but you're not actually doing what needs to be done. We need to support these grassroots movements around the world to actually say this is unacceptable. And it's only when enough hundreds of millions of us can actually get connected, share that energy in a semi-organized, but also free-flowing way, to make politicians realize they have no choice but to make a difference. That's when we're going to see the transformation we need.
Thank you so much. We have heard about transformation, the meaning of life, shared purpose, the importance of looking at things through the lenses of relationship and interconnectedness. And this is certainly very much part of the work we do. I would like to start by, or to end by saying thank you to everybody who has joined us, participants from different online platforms, the ones who are joining us through YouTube, the Earth Charter YouTube channel, Jeremy Lent's Facebook, or the platform of Baidu. I want to also to thank our partner organization in China, the CBC GDF, and Linda Wong, who joined us today. I also want to thank PACE Institute, who is headed by Wong, who has also been helping us with the organization of this event today, and the University for Peace, where our Earth Charter International Secretariat and Education Center on Education for Sustainable Development is located here in Costa Rica. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and I hope to see you soon in our next